Now, what I want to do now is I want to go over some basics about economic growth. And these basics are um, basic principles about economic growth that almost all economists accept. In other words, I'm gonna end up with some principles that almost all growth theories accept. And then after that, next week we can begin to look into the different growth theories and why they have different views. So let me start with a simple model that I know you're all familiar with. In a simple economy that consists of one person. Robinson Crusoe on his deserted island, or if you've seen the movie Castaway, Tom Hanks on his deserted island. Crusoe or Hanks arrives on this island and only has labor and land, right? Just the island and his labor. And in the movie Castaway, Hanks has two ways of mixing his land with labor. He can to produce consumption goods. He starts out either catching fish with his bare hands or going around the island picking berries. And I'm going to simplify the exposition by assuming that he has decided to fix his consumption of leisure, so he's only working 10 hours per day. We'll relax that assumption in a moment. If he picks berries, turns out that he spends the entire day picking berries. He can get 5 pounds. And catching fish with your bare hands is a bit tricky. He gets 5 fish if he spends the entire day. Catching fish. And let's say he spends half the day picking berries and half the day catching fish. Both of these forms of production will assume involve diminishing returns. He gets tired doing one or the other, so he can get 3 pounds of berries in 5 hours and 3 fish in 5 hours. And now let's put those options onto a production possibility frontier where we put pounds of berries per day on one axis, and fish per day on the other axis. So we have 3 points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And 3 and 3. And then if we connect all possible outcomes, we get our production possibility frontier. And you're all familiar with this. Every outcome within the frontier and along the frontier is possible, is attainable. Everything outside the frontier is unattainable. You might ask, how can you catch 2.5 fish per day? And the answer is by catching 5 fish every 2 days. So these are his available options. And moving along the curve also illustrates opportunity cost, right? The opportunity cost of catching more fish is picking fewer berries and vice versa. So now I've oversimplified, right? Only 2 goods. And I fixed his consumption of leisure. I mean, there's going to be other goods. He needs water. We could, if we could draw in 3 dimensions, we could put a dimension coming out of the whiteboard for leisure. right? And as he increases his consumption of leisure, this frontier is going to shift inward, and vice versa. But as simple as it is, it has some useful insights. What might cause the curve to shift inward? What event could happen to Tom Hanks that could reduce the number of berries he's able to pick or the number of fish he's able to catch? Sick, yeah, an injury, right? In other words, the labor becomes less productive. But also, the land can become less productive, right? Less rainfall, fewer berries. Note that if that happens, Hanks is worse off according to his own preferences. Right? We haven't made any normative judgments here. We're just saying according to his own preferences, he's worse off. Therefore, anything that moves the frontier outward makes Hanks better off according to his own preferences. That's unambiguous. And that's economic growth. Now, one way that the curve can shift outward is if the labor becomes more productive. If Hanks it becomes, after catching fish with his bare hands for a week, becomes better at it. Or the land becomes more productive. But there is a third way in which Hanks can become more productive without increasing his labor productivity or the productivity of the land, and that is creating a tool of production, a capital good. In the movie, it's a fishing spear. A more elaborate capital good would be a fishing net. But if Hanks fashions a spear or a net, right, what must happen in the short run to his consumption of fish or his consumption of berries or his consumption of leisure? It has to go down, all right? Now, why is this important? Because it illustrates what saving is in real terms. Saving in real terms is giving up consumption in the present. But why would he save in real terms, give up consumption in the present? Because once he's created the capital good, the fishing net or the spear, his consumption goes up. Right? And in this case, it would go up along this dimension. Now notice that in this single person economy, right, saving, giving up consumption in the present, and investment, creating the capital good, are one and the same. Nobody likes to give up consumption in the present. All right? Unless there is a gain in the future. This preference for consumption in the present over the same amount of real consumption in the future is called time preference. And it is a source of interest. Right? In other words, you translate this into a monetary economy, and it's why savings earns interest. Because people who are saving are giving up consumption in the present, but that is used to create capital goods to increase output, and they get more consumption in the future. In other words, a lot of textbooks get this backwards. It isn't that the fact that interest is positive creates time preference. Time preference is the source of a positive interest rate. And of course, in a monetary economy, where you can translate your savings into money and give them to someone else, you can separate the act of saving from the act of investment. All right, so, and this is the source of economic growth. Saving translated into investment. To give you some historical examples, prior to the Industrial Revolution, by traditional methods, in England, it took 50,000 hours of labor. 50,000 hours of labor to convert 100 pounds of cotton into cloth. As a result of saving, which brought 3 capital goods online, the thrustle, the spinning mule, and the self-actuating mule, it was $135 labor. Now, I've introduced invention, so I'm introducing technology. So technology is obviously necessary, all right? Saving is necessary, technology is necessary, all right? Savings allows the creation of capital goods, tools of production. They have to be embodied in some kind of technology. The big debate in economic growth is which is the binding constraint. All right. In other words, which is the constraint that makes it impossible, that constrains how much you can produce? Is it technology or is it saving? In the case of Tom Hanks, right, it's clearly saving. It's not technology. It would be technology if he landed on the island with the mind of a chimpanzee. But he lands on the island, actually. It's a plane crash with FedEx boxes. Those FedEx boxes could be filled with encyclopedias giving him all the technology, how to build railroads, how to build atomic energy plants. And none of that's going to do him any good unless he saves. So you need both saving and technology in order to produce capital goods. But capital goods depreciate. And therefore, once you've created your fishing net, or another capital good, right, you have to devote a certain amount of savings to maintain the capital stock. So let's now make this production possibility frontier a little bit more complicated. All right? And if we're thinking of Hanks, then we're going to put on this axis fish, berries, leisure, etc. All consumption goods per unit time, or C per unit time. And on this axis, we're going to put all capital goods per unit time, fishing nets, boats, whatever, which is investment per unit time. And now we see the trade-off, right? We see the trade-off between consumption and investment. If you're at point A, you're not savings, you're not creating any capital goods. If you move to point B, then you're creating capital goods, and as a result of creating capital goods, what happens to the production possibility frontier over the long run? It shifts outward, exactly. Anyway, you could, in the theory, go to point C and devote all your resources to capital goods and nothing to consumption and starve. People voluntarily don't choose that option, but there is one historical example where the rulers of an economy forced a large portion of the population in order to generate capital accumulation, starved a large proportion of the population. What am I talking about? Actually, that didn't generate very many capital goods.
Soviet Russia?
The Soviet Russia. Stalin wanted to prepare for war. He needed to create a capital structure, and so you have what's known as the terror famine, in which he essentially expropriated the output of millions of peasants who starved to death in order to industrialize the Soviet economy. All right, so once you're out here with a certain level of capital goods, there is a certain level of saving that exactly maintains the capital stock. In other words, this is the amount of savings that covers the depreciation of the capital stock. And the production possibility frontier stays there. If you're at a rate of savings above depreciation, right? Then what's happening to the capital stock? It's increasing. What's happening to the production possibility frontier? It's shifting outward. That's called capital accumulation. Right? Capital accumulation, an increase in the capital stock. Above, saving above depreciation. If you're saving below depreciation, okay, then you're consuming your capital. Capital consumption and the production possibility frontier is going to shift in. Now, so far, I've been holding population constant. Right? This is true not just of Tom Hanks on a deserted island, but of a large economy with many people. But we could divide both axes by population, right? And then we're talking about capital accumulation per person, capital consumption per person, and output per person growing. Capital accumulation is the dominant feature of the Industrial Revolution. And it was utterly unprecedented before the 18th century. Thomas Malthus had this idea that increasing population would eat up any increases in productivity and therefore keep the population at subsistence. He made this as a prediction for the future, but it turns out to have been true throughout human history in the past. Until the Industrial Revolution, from the Agricultural Revolution 10,000, 15,000 years ago, until the Industrial Revolution, 80 to 90% of the population were peasants, were involved in agriculture, living close to subsistence. Right? Doesn't matter whether we're talking about Han China, ancient Rome, or medieval Europe. The Industrial Revolution introduced growth in which output per capita began to go up. And it began to go up over the long run, year after year after year. So, for instance, the U.S. growth rate since 1869, the growth rate of real GDP since 1869 has been 3.3%. The rate of population growth has been 1.8%, and therefore the growth of real GDP per capita has been at 1.5%. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you have a sustained rate of growth and you compound it, there's the famous rule of 70, right? You divide the growth. You divide 70 by the percentage growth rate, and you get the approximate number of years it takes for output per person to double. So with a 1.5 rate of growth, the output per person is doubling every 47 years. As I mentioned earlier, output per capita in the U.S. today is close to $60,000 per person, every man, woman, child, and infant. You are the wealthiest people now who have ever lived on the face of the earth. Now, there's some terminology with respect to growth that you need to be familiar with. The type of growth that the Industrial Revolution involves is what's called intensive growth. In other words, output per person is going up. Intensive growth. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, you would have extensive growth, where economies would become bigger because there were more people, but no significant increase in output per capita. So you can think of extensive growth as doing more with more. I mean, one way of sort of bringing this comparison home is who has a larger total GDP? China or Hong Kong? Total GDP. China, obviously, right? They're a bigger country, more people. Who has a higher per capita income? Hong Kong. Right? By the way, Hong Kong's per capita income before it was incorporated into China exceeded per capita income in the UK, in England. That's a really bizarre type of colonial exploitation, isn't it? Sometimes when you read Snowden and Bain, they refer to intensive growth. Well, actually, I got it back up. With respect to intensive growth, we need to distinguish between sustained intensive growth and intensive growth that may raise income to a new level. All right? In other words, does the intensive growth have a level effect where it increases output per person to a new level and then stops there? Prior to the Industrial Revolution, there were level effects. Right? Per capita income, we don't have really good statistics, but per capita income in ancient Rome was probably at least 50% higher than in ancient Egypt. But the Industrial Revolution is characterized by sustained growth effects. And Snowden and Bain sometimes refer to this as Smithian growth. Why did the Roman Empire have this level effect? Well, because they created a unified trading district around the Mediterranean, and so you get level effects from reductions in transaction costs, increasing gains from trade. But Promethean growth is what Snowden and Bain referred to this as. It's from the Greek character Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods.